The point of this presentation is just to introduce you to a few of the resources that we maintain at the ILSI Research Foundation that might be useful if you have an interest in biotechnology and biotechnology regulation. I'm going to talk about 2 databases that we maintain and a suite of electronic learning modules that we've been developing over the last few years. So these are open access resources. We take our mission as a public service organization very seriously, and the overall purpose for us to maintain these resources is to improve, you've seen our mission statement, I won't read it again, but the idea is that we maintain these information resources so that everyone can access them and use them to make the decisions they need to make to contribute to environmental sustainability and human health. So there's 2 resources. I'm first going to talk about the GM Crop Database and explain what this is. This is probably the shortest piece of the presentation. This is the oldest database. It says here that it's USDA supported. That's not entirely true. It has received financial support on and off over the years on an ad hoc basis from USDA. For the most part, we maintain this resource as a voluntary activity. The second one I'm going to talk about is something called the Crop Composition Database. This is supported by a grant from CropLife International. And then the e-learning courses, we developed the platform with some support from the World Bank, but we're expanding that platform with our own funds now. So this exciting slide is a picture of the homepage for the GM Crop Database. No one can read any of this, and you're not expected to, but just gives you an idea of what the general interface looks like. This is hosted on the website for the Center for Environmental Risk Assessment, and the URL is up here. It's only a little bit important to note that we are transitioning mostly away from this website because the ILSI Research Foundation has developed a better web presence. When CIRA started, it needed to maintain a separate website specifically to house this database. And the database will continue here, but the rest of the surrounding website is probably not going to have much information on it. So I would encourage you to use this URL directly. The database itself contains information on regulatory decisions and the associated safety assessments for existing GM plants. And it has entries for both food and feed safety approvals as well as environmental cultivation approvals. These are some gee whiz facts. You can tell that the beautiful slides were put together by our communications manager. So we have information on 17 different biotech traits, approvals that are documented from 30 countries, and I'll explain a little bit about what that means, and about 192 events. This goes up almost every day, but when we made this slide, it was 192 events. One of the biggest exercises in trying to keep the database current is looking for countries that have issued additional approvals for existing events. This started its life as the AgBios database. When CIRA first started in 2009, Morven McLean, who was the head of the consulting firm AgBios, came to be the director of CIRA, and she brought the database with her. In 2010, it was really important to tell people this because a lot of people had heard of the AgBios database and used it. Now, not so much. People are used to us hosting the database and they know where to find it. But in case any of you have heard of the AgBios database, here it is. And again, the purpose of the database is to give people a single starting point. If you're interested in GM crop approvals and you want to know what's out there and where they've been approved, then this is a resource for you. It does not contain events that are under field trial. If you can imagine, the number of events that are being trialed in the world is much greater than the number of events that have been approved. And many of those events are for research purposes, and they'll never make it to the commercial marketplace. We've looked, somebody asked us if we could include field trials in the database, and I spent about 6 months just trying to figure out how we might do it. And I would never have been able to do anything else. I would be sitting at a desk cataloging field trials for the GM crop database. So we determined that we would stay in the business of looking at approvals only. The database has a lot of different ways you can search it. I'm not going to read all of these. It's just to give you an idea of the types of information and how you can find it. So the event names, most of these are built around the OECD unique identifier, and they'll have a 3-digit name for the developer. So if it's a Monsanto product, it starts with MON, and then it'll have a number. So MON 810 is a maize line, and you can pull that up and search for all of the approvals associated with MON 810. You can also look at the plant. You can just say, okay, show me all of the maize approvals, and it'll pull up all the maize approvals. So you get the idea. Countries as well, for countries that are interested, or that are listed in the database. When you pull up a record for an approval, you get a list of information. A lot of this is the same as what you can search for. But if you look down, one of the highlights of the database is that it explains a little bit about what the GM plant is. It tells you what the host organism is, so maize would be the host organism, but it gives you some background on the biology of maize to put into context this biotech plant, as well as the common name. Some plants are called different things in different places. How the trait was introduced into the plant, what that trait is, how it's intended to be used, and then there's a clever little picture of the plant. So these are we refer to this as sort of a product summary, and it's a bit of value added that we bring. Most of the actual information is taken from the regulatory applications and the developer of the product. They don't usually send them to us. We have to go looking for them. We keep asking, and right now only Bayer is willing to proactively send us information. So for any of you who work for biotech companies, if you want to send us information about your approvals, we're happy to get it. This is a little bit of what it looks like and some more information. The thing that is used most in the database is the summary of regulatory approvals. If you go to the common plants, you get a table with a series of countries listed across the top, and then the years and little X's for the types of approvals they have. So you can very quickly see whether this is a GM plant that has been regulated and approved in a lot of places or in just a few. And these are the lists. They're printed out in your booklet. You can take these home and memorize them, but I'm not going to read them all out loud. So we get a lot of users for this database. Invariably, when I travel, I bump into somebody who knows it and likes it, which I like. It makes me more popular. We know regulatory agencies use it. We know that academic researchers use it. We know also that the database is cited sometimes by product developers in their additional applications and in publications that they write. And certainly people who are interested. We get contacted by reporters and students and all kinds of people. About 128,000 unique visitors last year to the database. So if you're Google, this isn't very large, but as a biotech resource, it gets a lot of traffic. We are expanding it. We added 23 new events last year. There's 5 crops that never had biotech varieties in the database before last year. And importantly, 216 country approvals. So these represent additional countries approving GM plants that are already recorded somehow in our database. Looking ahead, we're always interested in making sure we're as up to date as possible on new events and adding additional country approvals. One of the challenges we have is that the metric is very high for country approvals. We need to see a document that is an official document that says this was approved. So, I did work in Pakistan, for example, and they have approved some biotech varieties, but it's impossible to get written documentation from them. So we know that there are biotech varieties in use in the world that are not in our database, but we have a standard that it has to be a written document that we can see and link to, because we don't want to put something in there as approved when it's not. A newspaper report is not good enough. It has to be a government decision document. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next database, which is probably a little more germane and in some ways a little more interesting, depending on how much amino acid composition data you like to look at. This is something called the ILSI Crop Composition Database. You can see the URL. We were very lucky. We were able to get cropcomposition.org. So this is very easy to find. This is just an example of the kind of stuff you get. At the moment, there are 6 crops in the crop composition database. It lists 3,000 plus different compositional elements. Which one of those apply varies from crop to crop, and I think I'll show you an example of that. And we have, if you combine these things, it has about 850,000 data points. I'm pretty sure I list the crops. So Zhang Lu put this in as an interest point. So the idea is, when you're thinking about variability in crops, what makes a crop, what gives it identity, and what are the variables? These are his examples. He would do a better job explaining them. But you see variations in crops when you produce them. And one of the things that we discovered when we started doing whole food safety assessment in the early 1990s was that we had very poor understanding of crop composition. There was some information, and some of it was very good information, in publications, in different places, using different methodologies and collected in different ways. So around 2000, a group got together, and they were part of what was then known as the ILSI Food and Biotechnology Committee, lovingly referred to as IFBIC. And IFBIC founded the database in 2003. It took them about 3 years to actually get the first build developed. And they recognized that the published data were often out of date, but I think more importantly, the conditions under which the data that were available had been collected was frequently unknown. So you couldn't repeat those experiments, and it was very difficult to do comparative assessment for GM crops that you were growing now. So they recognized that there was a need for a systematic, high standard composition database, and they set out to do one. The database was made explicitly for the purpose of providing a comparative data set to use to compare against genetically modified crops. But all of the data that's recorded in the database comes from conventional plants. There's no GM crop data in here. So it's all conventional plant data that's used as a comparator for GM crops. I hope that that's clear. That's the most frequent question we get about the crop composition database. The idea is that scientists and the general public will benefit from having access to the data, and I think it's no surprise to anybody that the companies that are big product developers for biotechnology use this database a lot. And they tell us that they use it a lot. This is a slide that Zhang Lu put together for giving this presentation in China. This is a Chinese nutritional database. The idea here is not that there's anything wrong with this database, and I have no idea what it says. It's a perfectly good data set that contains nutritional information, but there's a lot of information that's missing here if you were to try to use this data to do a comparison for a GM food safety evaluation. It's not always clear where these numbers come from. In general, it's not clear what the standard deviation is, how they were collected, how they were analyzed. whether the samples are averages or pooled samples, or you get the idea. So it's not possible to use this. It's a very good resource for other things for which it was intended, but it's not adequate for doing comparative assessment for GM food safety assessment. So when we started the database, or when IFPIC started the database, it originally had 2 crops in it, corn and soybeans. It's not an accident that those are the largest biotech crops. But over time, we've been progressively adding more. Every time we issue a new version of the database, we add data for the crops that are already in there, but frequently we add additional crops. So cotton was added in 2004. In 2014, we added field corn. Field corn and sweet corn are treated as 2 different things. So sweet corn is what people eat, and field corn is what animals eat. And the reason those are treated separately is that for field corn, they don't necessarily collect data on non-kernel tissue. So all the data is from corn kernels, not from leaves and stems, which is collected under field corn because it's used as animal fodder. The other major difference is that the crop composition database keeps track of the methods that are used to determine composition. And field corn, for those of you who know corn, stays out in the field for a very long time and it dries out. And so the subject of analysis is dried maize that's been sitting in the field for a long time. You collect that and you treat it in a certain way to analyze the composition. For sweet corn, you have to take it while it's fresh and has a lot of water in it, because that's when people eat it. They don't eat dried corn, they eat fresh corn. So the analysis methods are different. It's also true that in general, the composition of these 2 species are different. They're treated very differently in breeding programs. So that's a short course on corn biology, but it's why we keep these as 2 separate crops within the database. We also added canola and rice. The rice is a very small data set. We're really hoping to get additional rice data moving forward. As we speak right now, possibly any moment, they are adding potato data to the crop composition database. We're having some IT trouble with the host of the database right now, but certainly I anticipate by the end of this summer, the new version will go live and it will have potato data in it. And we're constantly looking to add more crops. Just to give you an idea of how things are represented in the database, all of the data is collected over a 19-year time frame, and that will change with the newest iteration as well. But the oldest data is from 1995, and the newest right now is from 2013. The second most frequent question that we get about the database is it international or is it just US data? And it is an international database. More than half of the data was collected in the United States. The reason for that is that that's where a lot of the field trials for GM plants are done. And that's where the data comes from. But you can see Argentina is another big source of data at 11%. Various European countries are contributing a little more than 10% of the data. Brazil only has 3%. My guess is that all of that comes from soybeans. Other includes a few other countries. But it is not just US data, it's international data. The measure for including it is indifferent to the country where it comes from, but it does have to meet a pretty rigorous standard for methodology and for preserving the samples and data collection. So that is the limiting factor at this point. These are some GWiz facts about how many data points come from what. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can see we have a lot of data on field corn. By far the biggest data set is for field corn grain for animal feed. Rice is very small comparatively. Soybeans is also very large, which is not at all a surprise. There's only one type of tissue that's done for canola, which is seed, and there's a lot of data associated with that too. This is just another breakdown. These are the analytes. As I mentioned before, different analytes have a different relevance depending on the crop. So if you think about canola, it's only used as an oil for the most part. So amino acid data is not particularly important. It's not in the database. For other things, all of the other crops, we have amino acid data. And you can see carbohydrates is not so important for oil, and it's not so important in cotton either, because that's primarily, as a food, it's primarily an oil crop. So you get the idea. There's different bits of data depending on the type of crop. And actually, this column changes as we add crops, depending on whether we see new analytes that are relevant for the crop that's being added. We also collect the normal proximate data. This is very baseline data on moisture, total protein content, total fat content, ash, carbohydrate, and fiber. These are the acceptance criteria. There's 2 slides. Again, I don't think anybody needs to memorize this, but we need to have information from the data provider on the samples. They're all from conventional crops, and they're all collected during controlled field trials. Historically, these are all field trials where they're doing comparative assessment between a GM crop and a conventional variety. And we take the composition data from the conventional variety. But it's not a requirement that you're collecting the data associated with a GM field trial. You just need to show that the field trial was done under controlled conditions so that we know the data is reliable. Not just, well, this is a field I had growing and I went out one day and I picked some fruit. Each data point is a composite sample. If you're into statistics and analysis, this is important to you. If you're like me, it's boring. They're not average data, but they do come from composite samples. So if you're going to do math with what you get out of the crop composition database, you care. We also record the location of the plot, when it was produced, what the sample collection methodology is, what the varietal identity is, dates of planting, harvesting, etc. Some of this data is available to the public user when they search the database. Some of it is not. Some of it we keep for our purposes. Some of the reason for that is that it's just an overwhelming amount of data if you're going to be looking at a method every time you see a data point. Some of it was a compromise with data providers. They didn't want to be giving us a tool that their competitors could use to say, well, this company's variety has 1% less alanine than our variety does. So they worry about competitive issues like that. So we agreed that we would collect the data and not make the variety data available to people. But we have it so that we know where the data comes from. There were a lot of lawyers involved in that discussion. It was part of the 3-year process for putting the database together. Fortunately, I didn't have to deal with that. And I should say the data providers they have representatives on a working group that continues to inform the database. And they work very hard on issues related to science of collection methods and how to add new crops. It's a very hard-working group, and we're very appreciative of their participation. So the methods that are used to collect the data has to be from a reference method. This means it's something that is verified in the literature or generally accepted among breeders for that plant. Samples are all analyzed in certified labs. This is one of the major hurdles for us to get data from public data providers. If you go to something like IRRI, the International Rice Research Institute, it can be very challenging for them to get these types of analyses done. We're working on getting more data from those public sector institutions. Quality control is very high because the data requirements are pretty stringent, and we retain the data for at least 5 years. A lot more data than what you see on the website is available to us. These are the search criteria. You can search by the type of crop, the tissue type within that crop, what year the data was produced, or the location. So if you're interested in looking at maize data from Argentina, you can search on that criteria. This is what it looks like. Again, there's not going to be a quiz, but I would encourage you to go to cropcomposition.org and play with this if you have any interest in compositional data. Some of these are pull-down menus. You can choose any of the 6 types from the crop type menu, and then you can, depending on which one you pick, you'll see the tissue types that are available for that. Like all databases, the interface is sometimes not as user-friendly as we want it to be, but we do the best we can to make this fit for purpose. This is the type of summary report that you get when you do an initial search. It will pull up a summary, and it gives you an idea of, say, for this is a maize grain report. He's asked it to do all of the maize grain data. And it highlights the areas where it has data, and he's checked these 2. So it's reporting fiber and carbohydrate analysis. You get a series of values that have meaning to you if you're looking for composition. This is the summary result. If you ask for a full report, you'll get something like this, and you get these these rows for each sample, and this is again a summary table. So you can pull a lot of data out of here. The next one is the gee whiz one. If you pull the entire report, this is page 1 of 2,498 pages of data that you would get looking for corn grain data. So if you're not careful what you ask for, you can get a lot more than you need. But if you're doing real compositional analysis, this is the type of data that you want. This is actually from somebody's publication. The data, there's not enough information on here to tell you what these graphs mean. It's intended to just be an illustration of the types of things you can do with compositional data and looking at large data sets like this. So whenever I look at this slide, which has been used in ILSI for a while, I'm always convinced that this is a bimodal distribution and not a normal distribution as they've drawn the curve. But the point is, when you look at data, you can get an idea for how the data looks over a lot of varieties, and then if you get a value for, say, a GM variety, you can tell if it's underneath the normal values, how it compares to data for other crop varieties. Again, this is currently managed by the ILSI Research Foundation's Center for Safety Assessment of Food and Feed, that's me. And as I mentioned, there is a working group. There's about 10 people on that working group, including from US FDA, and they help us decide what sort of compositional values and analytes are appropriate to include in a database, as well as having a lot of the data providers represented on the committee. Here they all are here. There's actually a couple of people from some of these organizations, so it's a little bit bigger than this list here. But these are the entities where they come from. We've tried very hard to get public sector representation. So there's government and private sector on here. But we have a very difficult time finding an academic who's willing to devote this much energy to crop composition. It's just not that interesting scientifically. So we're making some effort to try to expand awareness of the database to the nutrition research community, because they're interested in composition of food ingredients. Maybe I can figure out a way to convince some academics to participate in the database working group. We know this is used by a lot of government agencies. Get reports from some of the companies that put together applications that they've been asked not to worry about other sources of compositional data, to only cite the crop composition database, which makes me smile. We know scientific and academic institutions access the database. I'm not entirely certain what they're using it for, but we know they access it. Certainly FAO makes use of it. I attend meetings for the Task Force for the Safety of Novel Foods and Feeds. This is the OECD group. One of their largest work products is a publication on what are the important compositional components for a particular crop, for if you're doing biotechnology. And they use a lot of data from the crop composition database when doing that. ILSI has a task force on improved nutrition crops as well, and they like the database. So we get about 80,000 hits every year. These come from 127 countries, and interestingly, last year China was the largest source of hits on the database. If you're interested in anecdotal stories, I can tell you why I think that's the case. But maybe I'll leave it for the panel discussion. This is just a diagram of the hits that we get. It's a little bit small. Each of these dots represents essentially a node where somebody's inquired about the database. You'll see this big blob over here in and around Beijing. They're not entirely proportional, but they're somewhat proportional to the number of hits. It's used widely in the US. It tracks pretty well to where people live. This is mostly desert in here. It's also used very widely in Europe. You can see some in Latin America, a little bit in Africa, and then quite a bit in South and Southeast Asia. Here's the bigger version that I probably could have used to explain that to you. So we're looking at new crops all the time. Potato is almost in there. It will be in there very soon. Sorghum, they're dealing with a few questions about the data set, but it might go into the next version as well. If not, then the update after that. Sugarcane, they've had the discussions about how to collect the data. Sugarcane is a very different crop than some of these because of the way sugarcane is used. So they've had a very lively expert discussion on how to collect sugarcane data. We're also always looking for additional data on the crops that we already have. And importantly, it's not interesting to talk about, but it's important for the use of the data. We're always trying to figure out how to make the interface better so that people have an easier time using it. So if you all run to cropcomposition.org and do some searches and have feedback, I'd be very happy to take it on how we can improve the search functions in the database. And again, outreach to potential new data providers. So I think I still have a few minutes. I'm going to talk about another resource. This is not a database. This is something that we put together starting about 4 years ago. I should have had an insert slide here to pause and let me just talk. We had a large program with the World Bank. I put up one little gee whiz fact about it in my other presentation. It was a 3-year program with the intention of working in 9 different countries on biotechnology. It was a very important program for us. But we realized when we started it that it was going to end in 3 years. There was no mechanism to renew it or expand it. So we very early on started thinking about how we could continue to have a presence in the countries that we worked with without the support of this grant. And it got us to thinking about a great many things, including the fact that if I'm going to fly to every country where we want to have a conversation, that's a lot of hours on airplanes. I enjoy this very much, but it's financially irresponsible for me to try to be on an airplane all the time. So we came up with the idea of trying to build an electronic learning tool that would allow us to extend the life of some of our activities. And the website developer that we use for Sierra's website has some experience in doing website design for learning purposes, for education. And we were able to convince the World Bank that this was a good use of some of the funds that they provided for us in the grant. So we produced a tool for creating e-learning. It's not very dramatic to talk about the framework, but it took us quite a while to get it together. And we spent a lot of time and energy building the first few e-learning modules based around that program, the different activities that we were doing under the World Bank funded program. So right now, we have 5 modules that are completed in the e-learning program. One is on understanding low-level presence. So this is when you have a small amount of an unapproved biotech variety. mixed in with a variety that's either a conventional variety or an approved biotech variety. And it's just an informational resource. One on confined field trials of genetically engineered plants. So what are they? How do you conduct a field trial? Why do you conduct a field trial? This is actually by far the largest module. It goes on forever. And that's because it's built on a very, very expert training course that we had previously been conducting on how to manage field trials. That's just a warning. If you're interested in these courses, be very careful before you start this one. Application of problem formulation to environmental risk assessment, and we also have one on application of problem formulation for food and feed safety assessment. Problem formulation is a term of art, but it's analogous to a scoping exercise, and it refers to the process of identifying the types of information that you need in order to conduct an assessment. So it takes you through a series of questions. What do I need to know? What do I consider harmful? And how do I put that together in order to define what an environmental risk assessment or a food safety assessment looks like? These are very nice courses for people who are new to biotechnology assessment. And then we also have a concepts in food safety assessment course. This goes over some of the history, some of the material that I presented earlier about why do we do food safety assessment? What does that mean? Where does this come from? And it has a nice series of practical examples. Why did we do this? I've already explained this a little bit, but the idea was to provide a resource-efficient means to get this information in front of people. It's not replacing face-to-face interactions or more in-depth activities, but the hope is that instead of me going every 3 months, that I can go once or twice a year, and then in the interim people can take these courses. Different partners will use these for different things, and I think there's a good example later on. But the idea is it's something that can extend the capacity building that we do. This is another beautiful slide. You can tell it was put together by the communications manager. These are some gee whiz facts about the learning courses. One of the advantages of e-learning is that if I'm asleep in Washington and it's noon here in Taiwan, you can still take the course. You don't need me to do that. Whether I'm jet lagged or asleep or whatever, it doesn't matter. They're broken down into lessons that are organized to assist learning, and each lesson is accompanied by a self-assessment. So you can take a quiz at the end, and it tells you immediately if you got it right or got it wrong. It tells you where to go to find the right answer if you got it wrong. In theory, if you're using it for this purpose, you can get a score at the end and tell somebody whether they can be a risk assessor or not. It also has a glossary that is universal across all the modules. It's very intuitive. You see a word here, it's highlighted. You put the mouse over that, it pops up the definition for you. It is not the most sophisticated piece of software you'll ever see, but it's pretty good. We have tried our best, based on funding, to translate these courses into as many languages as we can. Zhang Lu Han, who works at the Center for Safety Assessment of Food and Feed, has been putting them all into Chinese. So he's always a little nervous. He wants me to make sure that you know it's basic Chinese and not Chinese the way you might speak it. But certainly we would encourage people to take a look at them and give us feedback on them. This is Zhang Lu's name. I should have put his picture in here. Here's his email. Certainly if you have any questions on any of these things, you can get in touch with him or you can get in touch with me. It's worth mentioning that we have no intention of ever charging anybody to access the e-learning modules. It's free to use, but we do control access to it. So if you're interested in looking at these, you just need to get in touch with us and we'll give you a login for that. There's two reasons why we're being controlling about that. We don't want the e-learning to just live by itself out on YouTube, because then we don't know who's using it or what they're doing with it. We don't want people to say, well, I took this course and now I'm a certified ILSI risk assessor, because that's not how the courses are designed. Similar, we don't want people to cut and paste out pieces from the middle of the course and take them out of context. So we just want to know who's taking it, who they are. Our biggest problem right now is everybody asks for a login and then they don't finish the courses. So we're trying to encourage people to go all the way through, both to give us feedback and so that we can explain that these are useful courses. Our most successful attempt with e-learning has been with the government of Kenya. They were one of the countries that was a partner under the World Bank program, and they were very, very eager from the get-go to use these types of materials. So we set up, they call it a microsite. It's basically their own website that allows them in country to control access and logins to the learning. If they're so inclined, they can edit the modules themselves. And everyone at the National Biosafety Authority in Kenya has to go through certain ones of these courses, and they all do it from start to finish because their boss tells them they have to. So the lesson for me is that trying to find partners who are going to use e-learning, we need to find people who are going to be able to tell the students that they must complete the course. That's the end of the presentation. Thank you for putting up with me for a second time.